Now, after all of these non-fiction, lightly fictionalized and autobiographical comics, we move on to some fiction. And the first book I have here is actually an adaptation from a prose novel, and I read this after I made my episode for a great comics adaptation in the 31 Days of Comics game. Because if I had read this before I made that episode, I may have had a different pick. This is Watership Down, the graphic novel adaptation written by James Sturm and drawn by Joe Sutphin. To say I'm a fan of the novel that this comic is based on would be an understatement. It's one of my favorite books of all time. It is something that I read when I was just the right age for it, but has really held up on revisitation, which may make you think that I would be obviously inclined to like it, but that has not necessarily been the case. As I discussed in my episode of A Great Adaptation, if the comics adaptation doesn't at least match the original, I wonder if it's worth it. Maybe it's the glow of recency, but Watership Down definitely feels like one of the best comics adaptations I've ever read. Now, similar to The Treasure of the Black Swan, where I was familiar with the artist but not the writer, I am here familiar with the writer, James Sturm, whose comics I have really enjoyed, but not with the artist. And James Sturm has a unique writing style, one that is sparse and rich at the same time, and that is perfectly married to fantastic art in this book for this terrific adaptation. The richness and the lushness of the world is contrasted wonderfully with the spare, almost mythic language of the rabbits themselves. If you're not familiar with the original novel, it's a lot richer than Dark Story, in which rabbits die. This comic does a magnificent job of adapting the world as well as the themes of that prose story, and it's a terrific standalone read as well. I would never say if you read this, you don't need to read the original for any adaptation, but I would say fans of the novel or the animated movie, as well as people who've never heard of this and are not familiar with this story, I would say this book has the capacity to impress everyone. From the classical mythic storytelling of Watership Down to a different kind of classical mythic stories, with the next 4 books on my list being part of a series of books. And this was a series of books that I've heard a lot about over the last 10 years or so. And I was finally, in 2023, able to get my hands on 4 of the 7 books out right now and devoured them. I'm very sure that I haven't understood everything there is to understand about the obscure cities, but that does not prevent me from putting these books on my list, because they're definitely occupying my brain, and I get the sense, will continue to do so for a while. These books are drawn by Francois Schuiten and written by Benoit Peeters. That's A Shadow of a Man, The Tower, The Invisible Frontier, and Lafebre in Urbicand. There are 3 other volumes published in English that are long out of print and very hard to get. I hope IDW reprints those other 3, but because they're standalone stories and honestly stories that you can read in any order, it doesn't make that much of a difference for now. In the tradition of certain science fiction and fantasy, the Obscure Cities comics use architecture and cityscapes as a metaphor, and all through various periods of time, a lot of these stories set up worlds with rules that often seem to contradict each other. As a reader, you navigate these stories at several levels, first trying to figure out what world and what time you're in, how things are supposed to work, and then deal with the complexities that the story heaps upon you. Each one is so peculiar in its own approach, and yet there seems to be some sort of a half-dream logic to certain things that I think I'm going to need at least one more read through each of these to start making sense. But the reason they're on this list is because they're definitely memorable. The stunning artwork, the images of these books haunt me, but also the quest stories and the puzzles, the slippery and the subversive logic of the plots. They create this sort of tingling sensation of you experiencing things that are not very easy to define. These stories could have been abstract to the level of inaccessible for me, but there's something that grounds them. That architectural scaffolding idea is so phenomenally represented that it felt like something completely unique, something that I hadn't experienced before. It reminded me of things like Fritz Lang's Metropolis or the Incal or even the comics of Sean Tan, but at the same time something I've not quite seen. I look forward to not just the other books that IDW will print in this series, but also returning to these very soon. And the last 2 comics on my list are once again, quite far away from everything we've looked at before. Although they do, now that I look at them, seem to also be interested in the structure of comics and use them in the way that they tell their stories. And the first of these is Almost Never, written and drawn by Jordi Lafebre and published in English by Dark Horse Comics. Like last year, I was invited by Near Mint Condition to submit one pick for my favorite read of the year, and this book is the one I identified for that video as my #1 viewer pick. For I think the last 2 years, friends online have been recommending this book. Dark Horse brought out this English edition, and once again, in the 31 Days of Comics game, on the day that we asked for a great love story, this book filled up those comments. That was sort of the tipping point. I love viewer recommendations, and given the enthusiasm behind this, I was like, I owe it to them to pick that up and take a look whether or not I like it. I shouldn't have worried because this was fantastic. This is a slim book, and I really don't want to spoil it because almost anything you say about it could be constituted a spoiler just because it's so slight and it relies on 2 or 3 things to do what it's doing. Suffice to say, this is a love story that's been told in an interesting mechanical format, but rather than just rest on that format, it is instead a glorious celebration of love and of humanity. There's conflict in this story, but that conflict just seems to be the nature of the world. There aren't any villains, there isn't any outright bad behavior, there's just pleasant, naughty behavior, but it ends up packing quite an emotional punch. I'm so happy that so many people recommended Always Never to me. I do think this is a book that, in spite of its slim nature, can take a fair degree of analysis, and I would love to talk about this in depth. And I get the feeling that if enough people read this book, it could have quite a reputation in years to come. I think about certain books like Day Tripper, whose reputation has just grown over the years because almost everyone who reads it loves it. I'm not sure if this can be at that level, but it certainly has that potential. It's one of those things that makes my most memorable reads of the year because I think it's one of those eternally memorable stories. So once again, Watership Down, half of the creators I was familiar with. The Invisible Cities, I'd never read anything by Schuiten or Peeters before, and Always Never by Jordi Lafebre. The other big work by him, Glorious Summers with Zidru, isn't available in English in print form, so this was the first Jordi Lafebre book I've read. And the last book on my list is by an old favorite creator of mine, by someone whose almost every work I have enjoyed tremendously, and I've been waiting to get to this book. I finally did this year, and I absolutely loved it. This is Leviathan, written and drawn and designed by Jason Shiga. I have a spotlight video on Jason Shiga, who I find to be one of the most gleeful comics creators working today. The last time there was a small children's comic from Jason Shiga, it ended up being Meanwhile, one of my favorite comics of all time. Like Meanwhile, this is also a choose your own adventure story, but it's also a maze and it's also a game, so it wouldn't be wrong to say that you play this comic. And once again, I'm going to have difficulty describing just how terrific this book is. I was absolutely engrossed by it. I played through it, trying to figure out if there were actually failure states or not, until I did find one. I got stuck in a loop. There's a day-night cycle. You can input answers that you have worked out. On a theoretical level, sure, it ticks a lot of the boxes, but it's the practical execution of this choose your own adventure, turn to the page, loop back around. The same thing that worked so well for the time travel mechanic of Meanwhile, over here being applied to an RPG adventure game style. All of those ended up being my proverbial cup of tea. I had a grin on my face from the first page to the last. My face hurt. That's how much this book made me smile. And in this crappy year, that would have been enough to make me thankful for it. Every now and then, a favorite creator will put something out that's a disappointment or not as good as the last thing that you enjoyed. And that's absolutely fine. That's just a natural part of making art. But the fact that Jason Shiga continues what I think is an impeccable record with this small little children's book that I don't know if anyone's talking about. Once again, lovingly embracing the comics medium, like the way all of these reads do. That's just the icing on the cake for me. So that's a brief look at my most memorable comics reading of this year. And it's been a very crappy year following a couple of very crappy years. Some of you will know because I shared on my YouTube community page and Instagram that my mother passed away this year after an illness that she'd had for some years. And this is following on my father's passing in 2020 and my grandmother and my aunt passing away in 2021. I think this year, more than any other, I got to a point where I just didn't want to read. First, I didn't have time to read, or I was too tired to read. And later, I just didn't want to read. I think maybe it's because reading is, as wonderful as it is, a sort of solitary activity. And maybe I was at a place where I didn't want to feel solitary. So I did other things. I watched movies and TV with my wife and played games with my friends. This also affected my video making, where I didn't want to sit by myself in a room and record things for an hour and edit things for hours and hours. And that affected my channel. But throughout that, I continued to get comments on old videos, on new videos. I continued to get discussions, and that connection was the opposite of solitary. The conversation around these videos and these books, the connections with people because of this channel, that is something that I've been very grateful for. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for commenting. Thank you so much for being there as part of this conversation. And I'll see you at the next video.